Welcome to the Movement series, where we explore one book, one chapter at a time to ignite fresh vision for disciple-making movements around the world. I'm Isa, and this season, we're walking through Spent Matches by Roy Moran, a bold call to rethink church and re-engage the mission of Jesus in a radically practical way. Whether you're a seasoned leader or just starting your journey, this series will challenge and inspire you to step into the movement God is already stirring. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we unpack your sources for those really potent insights and sometimes surprising facts. This season, we're on a special journey. We're calling it the Movement series. We're delving into sources that really challenge how we think about movement starting and, well, thriving. Today, we're jumping into the chapter 3 of our main text titled, Starting to Take Jesus at His Word. And let me tell you, this chapter promises to really push us. It gets into some fundamental ideas about the very, institution design for a global mission. We're going to face some, let's call them brutal facts, but also look for pathways to real change, impactful change.
That's exactly right. This chapter is really about peeling back those layers, the cultural biases we all carry, to see how our assumptions might be, well, seriously hindering progress. We'll look at how focusing on the wrong things, or maybe even just using the wrong words, can derail what's most important. Our goal here in this deep dive is to figure out what really matters for fostering genuine, multiplicative growth.
Okay, let's get into it then. So chapter 3 kicks off with this really interesting analogy. Chuck Yeager, breaking the sound barrier. It talks about how aeronautical engineers were kind of held back. They were emotionally attached to the old propeller design.
Stuck in the old way.
Exactly. They had to learn to let the form of the plane, what it looked like, actually be dictated by the function flying faster than sound.
Right. The function had to lead. And the text immediately makes that connection to the church. It argues the biblical function of the mission is, specifically, multiplicative disciple-making. That's the goal. But often, the form we've adopted, like maybe just planting traditional churches, doesn't actually produce disciples who make more disciples. In fact, it suggests that if you just plant churches in that conventional way, you might end up with, and this is a direct quote, buildings full of people who we would be hard-pressed to call disciples. Ouch.
Ouch is right. So the implication is stark. Our common approach might be prioritizing the structure, the form, over the actual function. The source even uses this really strong term, ecclesialatry, like idolatry, but of the church institution itself.
Yeah, ecclesialatry. It suggests our devotion to the concept of church, as we know it, might have, quote, gutted the biblical meaning of the word.
Gutted it. Wow. How does it back that?
Well, it goes into the words themselves, etymology. It points out that our English word church comes from Old English, maybe German, possibly linked to the Greek kuriakos, meaning pertaining to the Lord, like the Lord's house.
Yeah.
But the main Greek word translated church in the New Testament is ecclesia, and that just means assembly or gathering.
Just assembly. Huh.
Yeah. So the text poses this really critical question. Did our translators lead us astray by not simply translating ecclesia as assembly?
That's a small choice.
Monumental consequences, the author argues. It shifted our focus from a dynamic group of people gathering to, well, a building or an institution.
Okay, that makes sense. But then it gets even more provocative, right? This is where it gets really challenging. The source claims, based on research apparently, that the very institution designed for the mission has actually become the biggest obstacle to that mission. That's a huge statement.
It is huge. And the author, they really don't pull punches here. They argue, we, the church, have been wrong on so many issues that erasing the history we are connected to is impossible. And this history, this baggage, has created an image problem. So non-church-going people often think they just don't like us.
Ooh, it hurts to hear. But you can see how that perception forms.
Definitely. And there's this anecdote in the text about a friend in Kenya telling the author, you gave us the virus, now you must bring the antivirus.
The virus, what did they mean?
They meant the Western model, the addiction to titles, the focus on buildings, things that aren't necessarily core to the ecclesia idea. It shows how we've exported a form that might actually be hindering the function elsewhere, too.
So our forms, like the building-centric stuff, aren't just maybe inefficient, but actively damaging the mission's image.
That's the argument. Using church to mean the building, the text says, gives people this idea of a first church that's sort of above, beyond, or apart from them. It creates distance. This thinking relies on, quote, a fleshly, material type of wisdom, assuming that physical things, earthly structures, give credibility.
Instead of the people themselves.
Exactly. The text posits the church is a movement of people, not an organization. And organizations, especially big ones, have inertia. These structures are much too heavy to move through swiftly. They slow down a movement.
Movement of people, not an organization. That's a key distinction. So if the traditional idea of church is the problem, what is a church then, from this perspective? The source offers a definition, right? A simpler one.
It does, yeah. Very minimalist. A church is defined simply as a group of people who relate to God through obedience to his wisdom in the Bible, relate to one another through regular connections for mutual encouragement and challenges, and relate to their world by bringing God's order from heaven to earth through multiplicative disciple-making. That's it.
Wow. That strips away a lot. God, each other, the world, through making disciples.
Right. And the text contrasts this with North America, where we've become, in its words, maximalist, building these complex systems, leadership hierarchies, finance departments, marketing plans, all this infrastructure that, while maybe well-intentioned, often takes the focus off the core function. Simple, reproducible disciple-making. The form overshadows the function again.
And this minimalist view must change how you see leadership too, right? All those titles and structures we're used to.
Absolutely. It argues Jesus intended a different kind of leadership, one that leads from behind. A quiet, powerful influence of men and women who are catalysts.
Catalysts, meaning they start things, empower others, but don't necessarily control everything.
Exactly. It's leadership that doesn't create dependency. And the author goes further, suggesting titles that imply religious superiority are just not in Jesus' plan. They take Matthew 23.ni, call no man teacher, very seriously, applying it to pastor, reverend, all those common titles.
Right, even pastor.
Even pastor. The argument isn't that the concept of shepherding is bad, but that the title itself, as it's often used, has led to what the author calls clergyfication. Yeah, creating a divide, clergy and laity, building dependencies Jesus never intended, where ministry becomes the job of the professionals, not everyone. So those roles listed in Ephesians 4, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastor, teachers, the text suggests reading them as functions, as gifts in action, not fixed job titles or stations in a hierarchy. It's about what you do to equip people, not what you're called.
That's a fundamental rethink of church leadership for many. Okay, so if the forms, the language, the leadership models are all potentially problematic, what's the way forward? The text brings up this practical question for leaders. Is it better to try and change existing churches or just start something new? It uses that saying, it is easier to give birth than perform resurrections.
Right, and the author is pretty blunt here. They say neither approach, fixing the old or planting new in the traditional way, really works if you're aiming for true disciple-making movements, DMMs. Why?
Because both often assume the existing structures or even the mindset of the personnel can actually handle something as, well, radically simple and obedience-focused as DMM.
So people try it within the old system and it fizzles out. Often, yes. The text mentions many leaders dismiss DMM as too radical or not biblical enough because it looks different. Or they try, and the existing system kind of rejects the transplant. They get wounded, discouraged. But maybe the most sobering point, getting back to those brutal facts, is the money, the sheer financial unsustainability of the current model for fulfilling the Great Commission.
Yes, you mentioned the numbers earlier.
The Global Church Planting Network estimates needing, let's say conservatively, 20,000 new churches in the U.S., maybe up to 100,000, and the average startup cost for a traditional church plant, around $150,000 a year for, say, 3 years. Do the math.
The next billions, an extra $3 billion or more annually for the U.S.
Exactly. And the author just asks point blank, does anybody think that is going to happen? Not I. It's financially impossible on a large scale with current methods, besides the fact that those methods often aren't even achieving the core function of making disciples who make disciples.
So the system is not only potentially hindering the mission and damaging the image, but it's also financially broken if we're serious about reaching everyone.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot today in this part of the movement series, diving deep into chapter 3, starting to take Jesus at his word. We've really wrestled with how these deeply ingrained ideas about church structure, leadership, even the words we use, might be, maybe unintentionally, getting in the way of the mission. We looked at that challenge to let form follow function, drawing that parallel with breaking the sound barrier, and face those pretty stark financial realities of sticking with current strategies.
Yeah, this deep dive, it really underscores that a major shift in thinking is needed. It's not just tweaking things. It's moving from what we've always done, what feels normal, to what's actually required for a real movement of people. It's about maybe dismantling some dependencies, embracing simplicity, and really focusing on that core of obedience-based multiplicative disciple making. It's a challenge to confront the facts, but hopefully it leads to rethinking things from the ground up.
So after all that, what does this mean for you listening right now? Here's maybe the most provocative thought to leave you with today. If the modern church, in its current common form, is unintentionally the biggest obstacle to its own core mission, what concrete, maybe even counterintuitive changes would you personally be willing to embrace right where you are in your sphere of influence? What would it take to truly see a movement of multiplicative disciple making emerge? Some serious food for thought there. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the movement series. We hope these insights spark further reflection and maybe even action for you.
Thanks for joining us on the Movement series. If today's conversation stirred something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter as we continue walking through Spent Matches by Roy Moran. Until next time, keep leaning into the mission, because movements start when ordinary people say yes to an extraordinary God. To get connected and learn more, visit newgenerations.network.